What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Brown Girl Green podcast. I'm your host, Christy Drepman, where I interview environmental leaders and advocates about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as creative solutions to the climate crisis. I am very excited to be diving back into a topic that has been previously covered on the show, but we want to dive a little bit deeper, which is energy justice. I'm so excited to have a colleague and friend of mine on the show who is going to be diving into her journey of understanding all things renewable energy and the climate tech, clean tech sector. Because when we're thinking about clean energy and the future of what that looks like, we have to unpack like concerns around equity, justice, and who is and who isn't included in those conversations. So Kiki, I'm so excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Christy. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Oh my gosh. Well, tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your background in working on clean energy.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Kiana, or Kiki, Kiana Michaan, and I'm passionate about climate justice, energy justice. I've done a number of things in the climate and energy space over the years, working in solar with a number of different solar companies, nonprofits, particularly working on the permitting, interconnection, project management side of solar development at a residential and commercial scale. And then concurrently, I've also done things more in the activism, advocacy, and education side of climate justice work. So that's working on whether it's creating and facilitating workshops about energy justice or different topics in climate justice to then facilitate to students of all different ages, or doing more work on the policy advocacy side, and also doing things around kind of the intersection of art and activism and climate. So really a number of things. I just love the way that climate work can intersect with so many different pathways to creating solutions, and passionate about sharing more about energy justice work and both the technical side of that and how anyone can get more involved in their community. So thank you so much. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. You know, a lot about my show is being able to break down terms for people, make these concepts really accessible. And so, you know, you were using terms like permitting and interconnectedness, things like that when it comes to like renewable energy. Could you tell us a little bit more on, you know, your background of understanding like how the grid works and like, you know, what are some of the limitations of like how renewable energy is being built today that like is leaving communities of color out of the conversation?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we are facing massive challenges in terms of being able to effectively execute a just energy transition in a timely manner that is just with respect to all of our communities. So if you think about the history of how the grid was built in this country, it was built piece by piece, and we live, you know, in a geographic pattern of environmental racism, right? Where the environmental outcomes and the burdens and benefits of pollution and of energy are different depending on what zip code you live in. And it's no accident, right? It's because of historical policies and redlining. So when we're thinking about building the energy systems and grids of the future, it's that intersection of technical challenges and social economic challenges which exists in our existing electrical infrastructure. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges, but also I'm optimistic because there's so many people working on crafting the solutions for them. But some of the big things to take note of when it comes to solar development and renewable energy development is we need so much build out of existing infrastructure, right? So as we're now essentially changing our grid from being one directional, just delivering power to utility customers, to bi-directional, where as we have more distributed energy resources such as solar and wind, and we have more community owned and placed energy resources, they're sending power back to the grid. So we now need more resilient grids, right? That can handle increased load. Also, as we move to electrify everything, there's going to be a massive increase in the amount of electricity we're using. So we need more resilient grids, and you have areas of the grid that were already not serving communities adequately. So how do we, as we build out these resources, address the communities that need, which are, predominantly black and brown, immigrant, low income communities that need even more attention in terms of a build out of infrastructure, which we'll get more into that.
Right.
But yeah, so I think there's a lot I could say here, but so the technical challenge of building out transmission, building stronger distribution, permitting is a huge issue in the energy space generally, which I can talk much more about.
Yeah. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So we know we have these huge goals, whether that's, more on local level, state by state, of reaching certain targets of megawatts of solar and wind and battery storage. And in all of those development processes, you need to obtain permits. And a lot of these permitting processes are antiquated and extremely slow, and as a result can result in projects not coming to fruition, or just taking way too long. And we don't have that time, right? And so it's the balance of course, we need processes that absolutely do due diligence, especially when we're thinking about environmental justice and the siting of projects, right? Like, of course, there's a lot of due diligence that needs to be done in terms of, the placement on the grid where projects are interconnecting. But we need to streamline and shorten permitting processes. And this is a huge topic in the energy industry, right? Because we have permitting on kind of multiple levels. So there's basically, permitting can be extremely localized, right? Down to the township. And so there needs to be more standardization of permitting. And whether solar is new to an area, so building departments, authorities having jurisdictions or AHJs don't have experience.
What is that? What is an AH?
Yeah, authority having jurisdiction.
Okay.
That's what we refer to. Basically, a number of different governing bodies that you need to receive approvals from or communicate with throughout a solar development project.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
And so basically a lot of that is like really bureaucratic, but then it's also
Exactly.
not standardized, so people don't necessarily know how to like build a blueprint to make it really clear on how to get through those steps, basically.
Correct. So as I said, we do need due diligence. And of course, the larger and the more complex a project is, the longer approvals take. But there's a lot of time being lost because authorities having jurisdictions don't have adequate resources, or maybe, don't have adequate updated software, or everything's on paper. Just basically bureaucratic problems that are unnecessarily slowing projects down and making it hard to reach the goals we need to reach. And that also extends into sort of utilities having really long interconnection queues, which can be for a variety of reasons, but some of it too is just being unable to handle the number of projects going through.
Wow.
So a big challenge is, how do we kind of address how not standardized this is between authorities having jurisdiction, between different utilities, so that we're able to, in a more productive and seamless manner, push, solar and wind projects through and get them approved and built. And there are, there's definitely things being done. I would say a good example is NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, has the solar app. I don't know if you've heard of that, Solar App Plus. So that's a standardized solar permitting process that they've developed, and with the goal of that being used nationally. Of course, it is not quite yet, like it's having a slow rollout, but the idea that we can have more standardized processes where we can get projects to fruition faster.
Do you think there's like an opportunity in like some of these areas that are currently energy insecure, like that, like it's not that like it's skipping a step, but like because there's like this huge influx of like renewable energy, this actually could be like finally their moment to like develop more like energy security, or like you were saying, because there is like those disparities that are already existing, it's going to just make things even worse and people are going to get priced out. I mean, I know that's the dystopic negative view on it, right? It's like, okay, we put a bunch of solar and wind in a community that's already been disenfranchised, property rates are going to go up and then they're going to get, gentrified and displaced. That's like the dystopic view. Then there's like the more optimistic view where it's like, okay, if communities get involved in that process, then actually it could build more, economic security, more energy security in their areas. So I'm just wondering, like, yeah, like your just views on that.
Yes, no, that's a great question. Absolutely. I think the short answer is and both. Both things are happening. So there's good things happening, and
of course.
We're seeing also the same patterns repeat themselves. So I think when I'm thinking about energy justice, there's I think the three facets of it that are helpful to think about are distributive justice, procedural justice, and restorative justice. So distributive justice has to do with benefits and burdens being equal, right? So that you don't have that all communities are benefiting from clean energy. Like you were saying, who is, and I'll get more into that, but who is benefiting is a complex question, because just because a solar project is in an environmental justice community doesn't necessarily mean they're receiving the full benefits, right? So who is receiving the benefits, and making sure there's not a disproportionate amount of burden from, say, polluting energy infrastructure or in already disadvantaged communities. Procedural justice is about what we were just talking about being communities being involved in the decision-making process and having a seat at the table to vision, define, and be leaders and decision makers in what the energy futures look like for your communities. And then restorative justice is about how do we redress the harms of the past, right? So that's kind of about that piece sort of around almost like reparations, right? If a community has been receiving a lot of pollution and burden for many years, how do we address that in a way that's equitably making up for past harm? And so to get back to the core of your question, there's a number of things that need to happen, I think, for a clean energy project to be considered effective in an energy justice way, right? So you could say, okay, here is an environmental justice community that's dealing with increased amounts of energy insecurity, energy access issues, right? Another term also for the procedural justice would be energy democracy. So how can communities take that power back, right? And it's not just by the project being cited there. And this is where the stakeholder engagement becomes really, really important. So you need both who is the developer of the project, right? And are they from that community? I think the majority,
most of the time they're not.
Yeah, exactly. The majority of solar companies are white owned. We need more women and BIPOC owned solar companies of all kinds, right? So you have an issue where,
and just to interject, most of the funds that are actually funding those developers are not, those portfolios are also not run by people of color. I just want to say, because it's like you have to track the money. And of course there's money coming from the government, but most of it's from the private sector, from these bigger, venture capital funds, things like that. And most of the venture capital funds are not being run by people of color. So I just want to also add, like, we got to follow the money on like who's actually going to profit and benefit from these projects also.
100%. And also the research shows that VCs and funders are more likely to fund projects and communities that look like themselves, which is why we really need that increased diversity. So who are the developers who are actually installing the solar, right? So that comes to wanting more workforce development so that communities are benefiting economically, not just from the savings on their bills down the line, but from the being in the jobs that are getting those projects built, right? And then what is the financing structure, which you are pointing to? Solar projects are really expensive up front. They're not accessible. And yes, the systems will pay off for themselves.
Right, with the tax credits or whatever.
But also tax credits are not an accessible solution to a lot of people. Like if you don't have cash, a tax credit isn't that helpful, right? And so what happens is a lot of times you have different financing structures such as PPAs or purchase power agreements. And the question is, which sometimes can be fantastic, but a lot of communities in terms of when it can go wrong is essentially receive like predatory loan rates, right? Where they're being taken advantage of. And PPAs are a great tool because they allow homeowners and communities to not have to pay the full cost of the system up front, but then you also don't own your system. And so even though you're essentially paying it off over time, another company would own the solar system and you are then paying them for the power at a rate that's less than your utility rate would be. That said, you still receive less of the economic benefit than if you owned your system. And then the other issue is with, renters, right? How much of the benefit is going to the tenants versus the landlord when it comes to credits on the bill. And then, of course, there's been issues in New York recent times with utilities not adequately crediting on bills. But so all of that to say, we have solutions, but we have to make sure we're using them properly, right? And that's why community solar is a fantastic solution, because it allows community buy-in, and then you don't have to also have to site the solar necessarily on your home. So having financing structures that are actually giving people fair rates, having options such as community solar.
Could you define for people what community solar is?
Yeah, absolutely. Community solar is when, instead of, say, owning an individual solar system on your home, there's a larger solar system that many community members all buy into. And so it allows communities to share the benefits of solar without having to have that upfront cost.
Nice.
Yeah. And so, but yes, so we need to be thinking about justice in the siting of projects, in the workforce development of who's working on the projects, who's receiving the benefits from the bill savings. I think in summary, energy justice looks like thoughtful participation at every step of the process. And so, as you said, not every project is perfect. So it could be really successful in some ways and less so in others. And, basically there's challenges to every development and project. So thinking about how can, given the circumstances and limitations of a given project, how can you maximize the just benefits as much as possible? And I think that comes back to who are the stakeholders involved? What are their goals? Do they care about energy justice, and are they prioritizing it? Because not every developer is. And so we need just thoughtful participation of all stakeholders in solar development.
Yeah. And I want to touch a little bit more on what you were talking about earlier about, how do we make sure that there's more stakeholders in the room? How do we make sure people maybe fill these roles of, being a part of building that infrastructure, being a part of the leadership decisions? And this comes back to a big gap that I talked about on my platform, on my show, which is the green skills gap. And a big part of the green skills gap is that we have maybe a plethora of, these emerging industries or emerging jobs, in clean tech or clean energy, but we don't have enough programs or opportunities for people to skill up, train up, to be properly placed and be qualified to access these jobs, right? And, something that was brought up in a previous episode, shout out to Daphne in a previous BGG episode, she brought up that, sometimes these jobs are just about physical labor. And for, a lot of the ways that these jobs are getting marketed is Black and brown folks, use your physical labor and you'll get a good job. But again, there's not as much of a discussion of okay, after you take on this trade job or build this solar array, what are your longer term career opportunities to move beyond just physical labor, right? Or the green collar workforce. So I just wanted to intro with that of saying that we're in this interesting moment where we are in a big transition point, and that there is a lot of economic opportunities, especially for communities of color, to tap in. But we also want to think again about equity patterns. And again, how are we making sure that Black and brown folks are not just the ones building these projects, but also being given opportunities to shift into bigger forms of leadership to really ensure systemically that energy justice can happen, right? Because as much as we love putting people into trade union jobs, I think that's wonderful. But we also have to understand systemically, why is the grid the way it is? How are communities being designed and structured to be able to accommodate this kind of transition and ensure communities are at the forefront of that, that requires more diverse leadership. That requires people to be in higher positions of power, and to have bigger amounts of access, to be able to spell that out to people, right? And to make sure that decision making is in the hands of the communities who are actually living with these realities day to day, right? And so I just wanted to preface with that and to talk a little bit more on your experience, because, obviously, like you've been in this industry, you have experience firsthand of seeing, equity at every level, or inequities at different levels. And you've also participated in programs that have bridged gaps for people to be able to enter this sector. So I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more on, like, where are you seeing the industry evolve to make it better for more people to get trained and get a good job, but also, like, advance long-term career-wise? And, like, where are you seeing the gaps? Like, where could we fix this?
Yes, I think it's a huge challenge, and I agree. I think there are definitely a number of programs, some which I've been involved with, that are working to provide skills, training, certifications for people from EJ communities to do more of the hands-on solar work. But even for people who successfully go through these programs, there still remains this big challenge of then finding jobs and retention, which is really tough.
Yeah.
And I think the amount of people I know too who are just super qualified and smart in different areas of energy and still have trouble finding jobs, I think it's also just oftentimes like a tough job market, even with all these new clean energy jobs coming. So I think the training programs also need to go beyond just the initial training, particularly when it comes to women and people of color in the clean energy workforce. Like the studies show that mentorship is so important when you're in an industry where you don't see people like yourself. So I can think of a handful of mentorship programs that help especially get younger people into clean energy. So go beyond that potentially like initial get a certification and good luck, where it's like, okay, you can have someone who helps you through the challenges of being in the energy industry as early career, finding that pathway. So there's a handful of good programs like that, and I think we need more of them.
Are there some you can share?
Yeah, I think I know Young Professionals in Energy has a mentorship program. A little bit different, but, or maybe you were going to ask this in a future question. The Clean Energy Leadership Institute, they have EDICT, which is for younger career professionals, and that also helps place them in energy-related internships and receive mentorship from those who've been working in the energy industry longer. An example from some of the work I did with We Act for Environmental Justice, they were shout out to Charles, who is the best there. He the challenge they were having is training all these people and then not having the retention or finding the job. So ended up creating their own solar workers cooperative, which is the first Black and brown owned solar workers cooperative in New York City. In other words, to just create the jobs for themselves, to bridge that gap. So I think cool. That's a good example of more creative solutions we need, where if
it's like, we gotta just build it.
Basically, you have to make your own company.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a challenge. But there are a number of different programs, I think, throughout the US and I think of some in the Caribbean as well, that are upskilling solar workers and then also working to help them place in jobs, stay in jobs, providing mentorship. But I think I agree with what you said, is we need more pathways too for the jobs that are not just physical labor as well, which is super important, but also not accessible to everyone. Because of physical limitations. And so I think while these programs do exist, we just need more of them. And I think another challenge that I've experienced is that people don't aren't aware of different jobs that are available in the clean energy industry,
Yeah.
right? So you just think, oh, like installing solar panels, and you might not think of kind of all the other jobs that are available if you haven't been exposed to them.
Right.
So I think, to me, that goes back to providing more education to younger students and professionals, to make them aware of kind of all the different skills and how you can apply them to this work, right? I mean, you could work for a solar company doing marketing, communications, right? Project management.
That's what I did.
Yeah,
I did
there
solar
you have
marketing.
it.
Yeah.
So I think also that you kind of, if you want to be in clean energy, no matter your skills or interests, there is a way for you to apply them. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, right, a more like technical or manual approach to it. So how do we make these options more available? How do we make the pathways more clear? I think SEIA, the Solar Energy Industry Association, I believe on their website they have kind of some cool graphics where it's like solar pathway maps. You've seen those?
Definitely.
Where it says, if these are your skills or interests, these are different kinds of jobs you can find within solar.
Yeah, well, just to plug, Green Jobs Board is like, we're planning on exploring that. So we want to make a new area on our website, which is going to be different pathways, career pathways. So it's exactly what you're saying. So we're going to make different portals. So basically, people click on energy, we're going to lay out like, these are the jobs available that you could get in solar. These are some example jobs that we currently have on the board. And then giving people like how-tos of like a 101 of like, if you're at this level, check here for these resources. And like, realizing that a resource like that doesn't exist. So like we're currently trying to build that out on Green Jobs Board, which I think will be really helpful. I think for me, the gap is understanding like what are employers doing to carve out the space for people that don't have that level of certification or training or like pedigree, because that's a big thing. Like a lot of like higher up roles in solar get really technical, and the issue is like a lot of these companies want diverse talent, but then like they don't have clear fellowships or like pipeline programs to necessarily get people from like A to Z, especially unless they like have a master's degree in like certain aspects of like the energy field, from what I've seen at least. And so I think in order to create that diversity of opportunity, I think the onus does have to fall a little bit more on these employers who are like, okay, we have these like really big budgets for like, you know, maybe some implementation, but then it's like, oh, we have like a DEI strategy over here, but then it's like, but we don't actually implement or integrate it into the things we do, which in my view would be like transparency, it would be education, it would be building out internal structures for like, feeder programs to help people who come from marginalized backgrounds, whether or not you do have a college degree, to be able to have opportunities for advancement, right? So so glad you brought that up, because that's like really been top of mind for me in the storytelling piece, and to like think about who is responsible to build that infrastructure for the green skills gap. So
I'm excited to see what you continue to do with Green Jobs Board. And I agree. I think on some level, it just speaks to kind of a larger challenge, kind of institutionally, where education has become so expensive and inaccessible, but all these jobs are also inaccessible without that education. Totally. So I think we need even more sort of rigorous pathways or training program tools that make different kinds of jobs more accessible to more people, because
100%.
As you said, like not having a degree does not mean that you don't have, the potential to succeed in some of these jobs. So,
yeah. And when we're talking about energy justice, like a lot of people that come from these communities that require energy justice don't necessarily have a college degree. So it's all connected, honestly speaking.
Yes.
Going back to like this equity question of like bringing more people into the room, with these like trainings and opportunities, I think another big thing that like people don't really think about is things like transportation to even get to these trainings, or being able to like have outreach materials that are written in different languages. Like there's a lot of things that like I feel like the clean energy sector hasn't necessarily like addressed in being able to like make things culturally competent when it comes to like expanding diversity and inclusion in the sector. Are there other things you'd want to add that you think more people in clean energy, especially if they don't identify as a person of color, should know about or consider?
Sure. I I appreciate the point you just brought up. And I think these issues of access and barriers apply to kind of environmental justice work across the board.
Yeah.
You mentioned language justice. I think that is generally a challenge in environmental work, and certainly extends into the clean energy industry. That said, I don't know the stat off the top of my head, but a significant amount of solar workers are Latinx, and that's only going to increase. So I think there definitely is some accessibility, but it's not where it needs to be. And language justice is a massive challenge when it comes to having environmental information be accessible, or even say like as a tenant or homeowner, right? If there's a language barrier and you want knowledge around having access to solar for your home. And with transportation, the other thing you mentioned, I think the landscape of transportation is generally an environmental justice challenge, right? Of where we live and what transportation is available, and also how polluting that is to our air quality is a huge, huge challenge. And so I think it extends, of course, it applies to the clean energy industry, but I think it extends beyond that into the broader environmental justice, climate justice work. In terms of other barriers, for me, in my experience, and also talking to a lot of younger students, they're just not aware, once again, of what these job opportunities are or where they can go to access the resources, right? We've talked about these training programs. And then there's also, now more than ever, government funding to support both on the federal level. And I mean, I'm lucky to be based in New York State, where we have a really strong state energy governing body. We have NYSERDA, which certainly has its challenges, but then you have to remember that some states don't have that at all. So, you know, yeah, there's a lot to work through there, but these training programs exist. There's government funding to help put people in the programs, but a lot of times people don't even know where to go to find the programs. So a lot of conversations I have with people when they come to me asking for advice or resources is just connecting people to resources that they don't even know are there, right? I mean, I think even with the IRA right now, so many resources, and we need more awareness so that homeowners, tenants know how they can access these resources. So I think, once again, it's sort of building awareness that here are the pathways, and here are resources and programs to help you navigate them. No,
I love that. And you know, on a broader, more like international scope, when we're thinking about clean energy and equity, there's been a lot of stuff in the news recently about, you know, criticisms about what's going on in Congo, specifically that like Congo is this like hot spot for mining and child slavery, and things of that, and forced labor, all to be able to get minerals that are going into things like electric vehicles and solar panels, for instance. And, you know, of course, like there's like these really big ethical concerns around like, if we're moving for like a renewable energy transition, what are your thoughts on it? You know, there's no like right or wrong answers, but I think it's something that I haven't really addressed enough on my show. But it is something we have to like reckon with as people that are like pushing for environmental justice and clean energy. It's like, how clean is the clean energy when we track supply chains?
I think that every technology has a shadow. And so clean energy is the best option we have to move away from the fossil fuel economy and have a chance at having a less environmentally catastrophic future. And so we need to do everything we can to make that transition happen. And solar, wind, battery storage, these technologies have challenges and they have a shadow. And when I think about a vision of climate and energy justice, that is unequivocally linked to human rights, right? And so when you know, see these ideas of, okay, we're going to take every single car off the road and replace it with an electric vehicle, I don't know if that's feasible, in the sense of, yes, there's massive human rights concerns around the mining of cobalt and other minerals and heavy metals. And I think, you know, we might need less cars and more public transportation, right? I think we need to question I just think we need to question the systems more, because we're still at a stage where we are really going to dramatically scale up the production of these technologies. So I think there's challenges that globally we haven't even reached yet that just come with economies of scale. And unfortunately, mining is an extremely geopolitically fraught issue, because who owns the countries and the corporations that own the mining rights? Essentially, you know, the industry is at the whim of these. And so there's not a lot of options right now for where you can get these minerals in the quantities that are needed. And I mean, I think, I'm not saying I have a clear solution here, but, you know, between, the Congo and China owns, like, I don't want to say a wrong number here, I believe it's like 80% of the manufacturing of cobalt. These are just complex geopolitical issues. I don't have a clear answer, but I mean, I think with all of these issues and when I'm thinking about climate justice, it is like, how do we democratize a lot of these things, right? So if we're really thinking about, this is the future of the planet, but so much of the production of the solutions is still about, still in these political tensions of who owns what, whether that's, you know, manufacturing, production. So I don't know how we solve that. I think obviously when countries are thinking about national security and resiliency, they're thinking, how do we have as much domestic production of the supply chain as possible? So I think in a sense that makes sense. And through the IRA, the US is, you know, aiming to massively increase mining, because we've already seen how these issues affect the global supply chain, right? So I guess, and then with so much conflict on the globe, I don't know that I have an easy answer to how do we make the global supply chain less volatile because of human rights and political issues. We do not have such ethical issues in the productions of these products. Like, obviously,
better standards.
But there's not, the point I'm making now is there's just not a lot of options in terms of, so it's not, it's not like a cookie cutter clean answer. These are massive challenges, and energy is so global. I mean, we've seen how the supply chain has been disrupted by wars and what the impacts of that are. And the complexities of these challenges are only going to increase. That's why countries are looking at now like deep sea mining, right?
And the thing is, and there's also like places in the world that don't even have electricity.
Huge,
which
energy
is like
access,
energy
period. Poverty.
Like there's so much energy poverty, period, around the world. So it's like also sometimes like those of us that like live in the West and like are talking about all these like things with transitions and all these things, we have to also address like our own like privilege and biases also, and like what we have access to, and like what is like our accountability as consumers or people in these industries to be thinking about like these human rights issues. I think is something we all really need to like sit with and continue thinking about, for sure.
And it's a sort of a classic example of environmental and energy injustice, where then the people who are working and, you know, sacrificing their lives sometimes to contribute to these solutions are not benefiting at all financially, or not having access to energy. So I mean, I think this is something that needs to be addressed. And it's a lot to reconcile with.
100%.
That said, I think people might argue, because of human rights violations, like we can't do any of that, right? It's, I think these challenges can be overcome, and still even with the challenges and the shadows of clean energy, they are still, the outcome is enormously better than when we can continue down the fossil fuel trajectory, which also is filled with human rights violations. So it's not to say that like the energy system we have now is not is causing immense harm. So I don't know that we've figured out a way to cause no harm, but how can we reduce the harm as much as possible? And it's a huge challenge.
Definitely. Well, thank you for speaking on that. And, now, to get us towards, bridging the pieces together, you're trying to bridge a lot of these accessibility gaps through education and through media and creativity through your own podcast, which I would love for you to give us a little spiel on what that is and what it's about.
Sure, thank you. Yes, I have a new podcast. It's called Climate with Kiana. I liked the alliteration. That's really the story behind the title.
Love it.
Yes, I am definitely newer to the media space, so it's been a learning experience so far. But what inspired me to start the show was just that I felt like I was having so many amazing conversations with friends and colleagues about different aspects of the climate crisis and climate solutions. And then I would go talk to friends and family who are not in the climate space who just really didn't have awareness of a lot of these issues. So I wanted to essentially make my passion for these topics and enjoyment of the conversations I was already having accessible to anyone, because I think they're really engaging and interesting. And so the show is about climate solutions in a framework of joy and justice, because also these topics are really overwhelming. So how do we bring joy to it? And I had actually I'm going to quote one of the guests on my show, because Ariel King, she came on the show and she said, how do we make the movement irresistible to everyone? And I really love that line. I think that's what I'm trying to do with the joy element, is make it fun, even though the topics are heavy. And I've had you on the show. And
yes, I've been on the show.
We have a wonderful episode.
It's very good. We talk about love, romance, and climate jobs as well, which is amazing.
Yes, definitely tune in if you haven't already listened. It's a fun one.
I love it.
But yeah, I think really for me, in a sense, the show felt like a natural extension of conversations I was already having that were energizing me. And I just thought more people should be hearing these conversations. But it's also just been a fun experience to learn more about the media and storytelling piece. And I'm excited to bring a lot more energy justice focused episode. The first season has a lot of different topics, but season 2, which is in production now, is going to be much more energy justice focused across the board. So really excited for that.
Amazing. Well, beyond your podcast, what are some other resources or books you'd recommend for people to check out if they want to begin their journey of learning about energy justice? Where should they get started?
That's such a great question. I'll start with, if you just want to learn more about the history of the grid in this country, I think The Grid by Gretchen Bake is a great book just to sort of ground yourself in an understanding of how the grid functions and how it was created. Definitely going to recommend Shalonda Baker's book, Revolutionary Power. Amazing book. Highly recommend that. Also very accessible read.
No, that's great. And just to wrap up, obviously you have Climate with Kiana. Check out the podcast. But how else can people reach you and connect with you if they have questions?
If people want to connect with me, they can reach out via LinkedIn. It's just, my LinkedIn page is my name, which is Kiana Michaan.
What I really love about the work that you do is, you're really focused on being able to, you just had your hands and your feet in a lot of different buckets in the clean energy space, and having other people in this space that understand the equity gaps and are actively trying to change conversations around that is so critical during this time. So grateful that I got to share a little piece of you with the Brown Girl Green audience today, and just grateful that you are a leader in our community.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful for you and your ability to really reach people too through storytelling and education. So such a pleasure. Thank you, Christy.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Brown Girl Green podcast, where I interview environmental leaders and advocates about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as creative solutions to the climate crisis. I'm working to change the image of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. Make sure that you follow the Brown Girl Green podcast page, subscribe to the Brown Girl Green podcast, leave me a rating in the comments. Any rating helps with the show. And, stay in touch. Join browngirlgreen.com and the newsletter. And we'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks.